Good morning, everyone. Thank you for sharing part of your Saturday morning with me. I enjoy these day texts, so I try to do them as often as possible, except for Sundays, because that's usually when we do another show, or one of two shows, actually. Well, one is more of a formatted show, like CW Jaw Talk. We'll do that tomorrow, number 21. It's going to be another show in the series about the pre-Christian, meaning before, for the most part, before Jesus was born, although some of the texts we consider are datable to into the first century, but most of them are datable to well before the time Jesus was born or anyone ever heard of the Christians. So we look at the texts in that series that I have ongoing on CW Jaw Talk. There are different CW Jaw Talk shows, but there are several series ongoing. And one of them is about the pre-Christian texts. Not just biblical texts that have been translated today, which are obviously important, but the people who don't really accept Jesus or see any good reasons for accepting him don't rely on because they think it's just something that's been translated and passed down over a long period of time after Jesus was here, if he was ever here. Of course, I've written an article and done shows showing there's evidence from Jews, Christians, and non-Jews and non-Christians that write about and speak of Jesus and those who followed him. So we look at that evidence and we look at the evidence before Jesus was born to try to determine what it was people were expecting or believing. Let me adjust this monitor just a little bit there. Before the Messiah came, or in our view, before the biblical. We're talking about the biblical, okay? So it doesn't matter if you believe in a Messiah or anything in the Bible. But if you're curious about what the Bible does teach, the biblical books in the Bible, which we consider the best collection of history related to Jah, Jesus, and all these things. If you're interested in the best texts preceding Jesus' birth that speak of things that appear to be uniquely fulfilled in him, then join me for that series tomorrow, number 21. I've done 5 shows already in that series highlighting some of that type of evidence. And tomorrow we're going to look at Isaiah 9, maybe part of Isaiah 11. 2 sections of one of our best texts that is in a basically complete copy, and another extensive copy of Isaiah, several hundred years, datable to several hundred years before Jesus was born. The Isaiah scroll is one of our best and most well-known texts. So we're going to take a look at it and what it has to say about the one who was believed to come as a prophet like Moses and a Messiah from God. So this is the biblical teaching, right? If you don't accept these things, that's fine. We're here to present the evidence for why we do, and at least show you why so many people look to Jesus in these ways. So that's tomorrow. We'll start that show probably around 9 o'clock. You can look at the notification I'll put up later today. And then you can take a look at the prior shows as well if you're interested in what we've discussed so far. Okay, so now in our day texts, we're in the Revelation, the book of Revelation. We go through these different biblical books and sometimes other related books and texts, some of which are referred to by the biblical writers, like Jude. He refers to texts like 1st Enoch and what we refer to as the Assumption of Moses, 2 texts related to the Bible and figures in the Bible, but that aren't complete enough or in a good enough condition and representation over time so that they're considered credible enough to be included in the biblical collection entirely. So, but they were still looked to by some of these biblical writers as accurate sources of information about some of these events. So we look at everything. We look at good reasons, good evidence. That's what we want to know. So when we read Revelation, it's with all of this understanding in mind. We're not just looking at the Revelation as just one book in an English translation a couple thousand years after the fact. We go all the way back and we go before texts like the Revelation were even written to look and to see what they were believing over periods of thousands of years and whether it makes sense, whether it fits with the archaeological evidence, the historical and literary evidence. And we look at everything that we can, just like we would with anyone else historically, but even more so when it comes to things that involve religion, because we want to be accurate. Right? We don't want to just say things because we hope they're true. We want to be able to say things because we really believe they're true, or they're based on the best evidence. So when I read from you in our day text material from Revelation, understand, if you're joining us for the first time or you're somewhat new, that these texts are written in the context of all that history and belief and evidence. So when it talks about things that are future, like a new heavens and new earth, it's not just a hope. Like I said, it's based on a long history of evidence that we can trace all the way back to a place the Bible identifies as Eden. We can actually show with satellite imagery where, as the Bible describes, 4 rivers flowed into one at the time when Eden existed. There's also evidence for the flood, for other places like Sodom and Gomorrah, the Tower of Babel. We talk about all this stuff, and then we get to these texts, because the same God, Jah, who was involved with all those things, Eden, the flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, Tower of Babel, Moses, the Exodus, all of those things involve the exact same God. And he's the one who was telling all these different people, like Isaiah, Micah, Moses, David, about this one. And then we have someone like Jesus who comes and uniquely fulfills all these things, and all these people write about him, and everything changed. The whole world. Even our calendars aren't the same, although Jews and others still use their own calendar. My point is, things changed in a dramatic way, and in a way that no longer allows for the things that Jah said would take place to take place. Because the temple, the sacrificial arrangement, and all the things that the Messiah would have to fulfill according to the law of Moses are no longer happening. So we look to these things with confidence. We understand not everyone agrees. That's why we talk about it. So let's share with you the hope we have now. You've probably heard of different Christian ideas and beliefs. So this section pretty much captions fairly well what we believe is going to happen. Well, let's take a look at it. Revelation 21, 1 through 8. I put the reading in the description below if you want to follow along according to my translation. Or you can read any translation you'd like. Okay, and then after we're done, I'm going to do a little bit of a follow-up, another part to the Alpha and the Omega, okay? So if you want to know more about the Alpha and the Omega in reference in one of the verses in our reading, and in a couple other texts that I haven't translated yet, then hang tight, because we're going to get to it. First, the reading. Revelation 21, 1. Let me just verify. I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first earth and the first heaven are gone, and the sea is no more, or no longer exists. I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from heaven from God, having been prepared like a young bride, having been made beautiful for her husband. Verse 3. I heard a great voice from the throne saying, Behold, the protective dwelling of God is with humans, mankind, and he will protectively dwell with them, and they will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. Verse 4. God will completely remove every tear from their eyes. Death will no longer exist, nor will sorrow, nor will crying, nor will pain exist any longer. These first things are gone. Verse 5, the one sitting on the throne said, See, I'm making all things new. He also says, Write, because these words are faithful and true. Verse 6, he also said to me, These things have become ready. I am the start and the finish, or I am the A and the Z, the Alpha and the Omega. We're going to talk more about this later in the show. The beginning and the end. Simply because I want to. I will give to those who are thirsting from the spring of water of life. Verse 7, the one who receives a favorable judgment. Remember, previous to this reading, we've talked about how everyone is brought up and judged according to their works. The one who receives a favorable judgment, verse 7, will inherit these things, and I will be God to him, and he will be a son to me. Verse 8, but as for those who are afraid, and for those who are without faith, they don't believe. All this evidence and they don't have any faith. For those for those involved in grossly immoral sex, for those who practice magic, for those who worship idols, and for all the liars, their portion is in the lake that is burning with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. This does not necessarily, just so you know, depict a fiery torment and torture. It doesn't say that. It says it's the second death. Death is the opposite of life. When you die, you're dead. Ecclesiastes 9:5. But we know you can also be made alive. It's just that this text does not state that you will be tortured the way many groups teach. But that's for Jah to decide in terms of what actually happens with people whose souls are judged unfavorably. But it doesn't refer to any conscious torment here. Jesus talks about it by illustration in Luke chapter 16. But he does so in a way that does not make it literal by any means. My point is here that those who commit themselves, right? And we see a lot, we know what grossly immoral sex is, right? We know what normal sex is. And we can see people who either abuse children or who deny their anatomy in ways that require them to abuse another person or be abused in order to have sexual relations. It's not hard to see what grossly immoral sex is. It doesn't mean they can't do it. No one's saying it's illegal. We're just saying that if you continue to do things that are abusive to your or other people's bodies sexually, or you abuse children, you're a pedo, well, you're taking a pretty big chance right there, aren't you? I highly recommend you stop that kind of conduct because you weren't made to do it. You have one male reproductive organ or one female reproductive organ. Use those together. You'll be fine. If you go way beyond that or too far beyond that at all, it's not how you're designed. You don't need me to tell you. You know how you're made. Those who murder, those involved in who practice magic, and we're not supposed to be casting spells on people. We're not supposed to be binding people in a spell or a ritual circle. We're not supposed to be using imagery and symbols that invoke the very spirits that just want to control you when you invoke them and who are resisting Jah, right? I mean, so you're taking an even bigger chance with that because you don't even know what you're involved with completely. Whereas with grossly immoral sex, you kind of know what you're doing there. It's all right there, right? But magic, you go through the process, you do the rituals. There's things there you're not aware, but you're trusting in through these rituals. That never works out for people. I have never seen that work out in a way that makes me think, wow, I got to get involved in magic so I can be like that person, right? I mean, if Aleister Crowley is the symbol of what, or the pinnacle of the practice of magic, we run from that, right? That's like how to destroy yourself real quickly. Follow Aleister Crowley, right? I mean, how did he end up? Just look at him. Look at his life. Look at how his life ended with all that power and stuff. What else do you need to know? Their portion is in the lake that is burning with fire and sulfur. Okay, second death. Those who are risen with Christ because they were cut down for his sake cannot die again. The ones who do all these terrible, rotten, and disgusting things and who die, but they were so terrible, horrible, and disgusting. It seems to me like, according to the reading previously, they're going to be brought to life again and judged according to how bad and terrible their ways were. Because maybe they just died while they were alive on earth, right? And they're asleep essentially in death until that time when they're made alive again to be judged. And then the second death. They're going to die twice. Whoa. No way. We if all at all just want to deal with that once, right? Then we come back alive and we keep doing the good things. But if we have to die because of our terrible behavior in this world, and then we're brought back alive to be judged because we were so terrible and horrible that the death we received in this life wasn't enough, then you're going to die again. It says right there, second death. And it said before that those who are risen alive with Christ because of being cut down cannot die again. So there's your contrast. New heavens and a new earth with mankind. We talked a little bit about this in Revelation 7, where it used very similar language. God is with humans. Talks about how he's going to give those who are thirsting to drink from the spring of water of life, verse 6. And that's the same verse where he calls himself the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that. Excuse me, and I'm going to do that because I haven't translated all of Revelation 22. I've only done through verse 5, 1 through 5. But there are a couple other verses that are after verse 5 that involve the Alpha and the Omega, or that involve someone who is similar to the Alpha and the Omega but differentiated from Jesus. And so I'm going to use the New World Translation, as I often do since I'm familiar with it, for texts I haven't translated, and we'll read them, and then we'll relate them to verse 6, pretty much verse 6 of our reading today. So 21:6 says, we're going to jump into the Alpha and the Omega now for part 3 of that. In Revelation 21:6 it says, he also said to me, these things have become ready. I'm the start and the finish, or the Alpha and the Omega, the A and the Z, beginning and the end. Okay, so now let's take a look, since I haven't translated all of Revelation 22. We will look at the New World Translation of the text, and if there are any issues, of course, I'll be happy to discuss them. But I'm doing it for convenience so we can look at this material and answer a couple additional questions about the Alpha and the Omega in Revelation 21:6 and in chapter 22. All right, so Revelation 21:6 references both the Alpha and the Omega, and it speaks of those thirsting, drinking from the spring of water of life, both of which tie into Revelation 22, and so are good for both our day text and our Alpha and the Omega series. So let's read Revelation 22 through 1 through 7. And then we'll read one extra verse. But follow me here. This is very important. So you're going to see here more about those who drink from the springs of water of life, like we read about in our day text reading, Revelation 21:6. And then we're going to go into the Alpha and the Omega discussion as it relates to certain arguments people make that claim that the way Jesus speaks identifies him as the Alpha and the Omega. So let's take a look. We'll look at also a couple verses later on in chapter 22, but let's look at verses 1 through 7 first. Okay, it says, and he showed me a river of water of life. Remember the springs of water of life that we read in Revelation 21:6. Waters of life clear as crystal, flowing out from the throne of God and of the Lamb. And remember, according to Revelation chapter 3, Jesus sat down on his Father's throne after he conquered, just as those who conquer will sit down with him on his throne. And the throne of God, it says in verse 3, or actually it uses that same expression, throne of God and the Lamb, in verse 3, but I'm still in verse 1. So we read verse 1, the rivers flowing out of the throne of God and of the Lamb. Verse 2, down the middle of its broad way, and on this side of the river and on that side, there were trees of life producing 12 crops of fruit, yielding their fruits each month. And the leaves of the trees were for the curing of the nations. So we definitely have nations existing on the earth during this time when the river of life is flowing out from the throne of God and the Lamb, which is after The new heavens and the new earth are existing, and New Jerusalem has come down out of heaven, according to Revelation 21. Verse 3, and no more will there be any curse, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and his slaves will render him sacred service, and they will see his face, verse 4, and his name will be on their foreheads. Verse 5, also, night will be no more, and they have no need of lamplight, nor do they have sunlight, because the NWT uses the divine name here. Jehovah God will shed light upon them, and they will rule as kings forever and ever. Excuse me. Verse 6, we're going to be transitioning now into the Alpha and the Omega part, but keep in mind what we just read as it relates to those who are thirsting and drinking from the fountain or river of water of life, clear as crystal. And there's these trees that are produced that give us leaves so that we can heal the nations. And the curse will be removed. The curse that has been on this earth since Adam and Eve, and then again since their son murdered his brother. Verse 6. I think we did read verse 5. Okay, and he said to me, these words are faithful and true. Yes, Jehovah the God. This isn't a quotation from the Old Testament, so I don't agree with the use of the divine name here. But I'm going to read it because I'm reading NWT, okay? This isn't about the divine name, but I'll explain it briefly because I know that would stand out to a lot of people reading this text, but not the NWT. He said to me, these words are faithful and true. Yes, Jehovah the God of the inspired expressions of the prophets sent forth his angel to show his slaves the things that must shortly take place. And look, I am coming quickly. Happy is anyone observing the words of the prophecy of this scroll. And then, so the reason I'm citing this text is because it's the intro part to what we're going to read next about the Alpha and the Omega, which will connect it to Revelation 21 in that sense. But this first part of Revelation 21 connects with those thirsting and who drink from the fountains of waters of life, or the rivers of waters of life. So I wanted to include that to connect it with the main idea of our day text, being the conditions that we look forward to and hope for in the new heavens and the new earth. Okay, so now with that build-up in mind, we're going to jump down to verse 12 of Revelation 22, and we're going to talk more about the Alpha and the Omega. So we're going to read from the NWT because I have not translated all of these texts yet. And let's see what it says. Revelation 22:12. Look, I am coming quickly, and the reward I give is with me, to render to each one as his work is. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Happy are those, verse 14, who wash their robes, that the authority to go to the trees of life may be theirs, and that they may gain entrance into the city by its gates. Verse 15, outside are the dogs, and those who practice spiritism, and the fornicators and the murderers, that fornicator being porneia, the grossly immoral sexual people, and the murderers and the idolaters, basically restating what we read earlier in Revelation 21 in our day text, and everyone liking and carrying on a lie. It's basically identical to the kinds of things that we read about in Revelation 21:8. Okay, so now notice verse 16. I, Jesus, sent my angel to bear witness to you of these things for the congregations. I am the root and the offspring of David and the bright morning star. Now, this is where many Trinitarians will go and say, see, right here, you have Jesus identifying himself. I, Jesus. And here in verse 13, it says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, first and the last, beginning and the end. So they say, well, so why don't you see that this is Jesus talking here? Well, first of all, I would point out that God sent his angel, just like Jesus sent his angel. According to Revelation 1:1, God gave the revelation to Jesus, right? A disclosure of divine information. So right there, we know he's not God. But let's go on. He gives this information to Jesus according to Revelation 1. You can read it yourself. Jesus then gives it to his angels, who then give it to John. And so you have angels and Jesus speaking for God just like you do throughout the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament. It's not unusual at all. It happens in as famous of an account as Moses in the burning bush. According to Acts, those were angels talking to him. According to the account, it was John. The angels are speaking for their Father. They're representing their Father. They can speak as their Father because they're imitating him and worshiping him in the absolute sense. But so we can easily understand it in relation to the way and manner in which these angels, sons of God, represent and speak for Jah when they don't do their own thing, and understand Jesus being the Alpha and the Omega just like that, just like we refer to him as God or Jah. Not because he is that, but because Jah is making him that to us, and he does it. He agrees only to do, say, and teach what the Father told him and taught him. John 7:16, 17. He says it all over the place. So whether he's receiving a divine disclosure of information here, or he's talking about being taught by the Father in John 7, he's always receiving what he's saying from the Father. That's why he said in John 14, if you've been with me this long and you haven't figured it out yet. And then he goes on to say exactly what he means. The Father is working through him. But I don't really think that's what's happening here. I mean, I do think Jesus and the angels are speaking for Jah throughout the Revelation. But what I'm saying is, I'm not sure that's the primary explanation for the way that the narrative flows. You see, what Trinitarians are doing, they're being dishonest, or they're just ignorant. Because this follows the exact same speech pattern that is up here in verse 7 and 8. Right here, I am coming quickly. Happy is anyone observing the words of the prophecy of this scroll. Now, there's this term is not there. There's no term that really interferes or creates this. It really just says, I, John. Just like it says, I, Jesus. Is John the one coming quickly? No, because if he was, then we would have a much bigger issue, right, of identification. And because this is the one coming quickly right here, the Alpha and the Omega. So is John the Alpha and the Omega? Right before, it does the exact same thing it does a few verses later. And if that's not enough, let's go back to Revelation chapter 1. Notice this pattern, which is identical to the way Revelation 22, and where it says, I, Jesus, it's identical to the speech pattern where it says, I, Jesus, pretty much right after the Alpha and the Omega speaks. Notice Revelation 1. Look at verse 7. Look, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, and those who pierced him. All the tribes of the earth will beat themselves in grief because of him. Yes, amen. I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, the one who is and who was and who is coming. All right, so let's just stop for a moment here. Now notice Revelation 1:4. John gives undeserved kindness and peace from whom? The one who is, who was, and who is coming. And from the seven spirits, and from Jesus Christ. So the one who is and who was and who is coming is obviously not Jesus Christ, the firstborn from the dead. But notice that here in verse 7, or in verse 8, when it refers to the one who is and who is coming, I am the Alpha and the Omega. What does it say in verse 9? I, John. Is John the Alpha and the Omega? Is John the one coming quickly, like in Revelation 22? We'll go back to in a minute. Twice, John, the one writing these things, uses this style where he quotes someone else and then breaks with a first person pronoun named reference and a different speaker. It's the exact same pattern. In fact, it's done right after the exact expression we're talking about. Well, part of it anyway, the Alpha and the Omega. But I mean, it's not even separated by any verses. It's right after it. I, John. I am the Alpha and the Omega. I, John. Let's go back to Revelation 22, because the Trinitarian apologetic nuts are often dishonest. They don't show you Revelation 1 like I just did. They don't show you Revelation 22:7 where I am coming quickly, I, John. And they'll only show you this, Revelation 22:13, I am the Alpha and the Omega. Now notice that's 3 texts, or it's 2 whole texts earlier than the first person pronoun reference and the name Jesus. In Revelation 1:7, it was right. I mean, 1:7 and 8, it was right after. I am the Alpha and the Omega, I, John. I mean, here you've got several texts, but it's still the same speaker. That's why NWT uses this closed single quote right there, and then begins a new quote with Jesus in the double quotes and the single quotes, because you've got angels and Jesus speaking for God throughout. My point is, the dishonest Trinitarians who quote this text and then try to highlight this and say, you see, it's Jesus talking, they either didn't read a couple verses earlier, and so therefore are suspect in terms of their preparation, or they're dishonest in hiding this from you. They know this is how John writes the text, and they're trying to deceive you to get you to believe this in an inaccurate manner. I'm trying to highlight, but my little thing is, see, whenever I adjust that, it jumps around. They're trying to get you to believe just this. I am the Alpha and the Omega, I, Jesus. See? Then you show them this, they break down. The whole argument shuts down. They'll try to say it's not exact. It's the same type of writing style. Personal pronoun followed by a name right after the reference involved in someone else speaking. It's the same thing, but Revelation 1:4 is even better because it's identical to the part in Revelation 22 where Jesus says, I, Jesus. And it's even more convincing if you were to argue as Trinitarians do, that because personal pronoun and name follow someone speaking means you're that person. If that's the case, well then for sure John is the Alpha and the Omega, right? I mean, it's right there. There's no intervening material. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the one who is and was and who is coming, the Almighty. I, John. You see what they're doing? That's what they're doing when they try to mislead you about I am the Alpha and the Omega, first and last, beginning and the end, I, Jesus. It's the exact same thing in Revelation 1. And it's pretty much exactly the same as a couple verses earlier. It's just the way John writes. But they lie to you, or they just don't know enough, and so therefore shouldn't be teaching. Or they had someone lie to them, and they're just convinced, and they're excited, and so here they come to you, right? We understand that. But the fact is, they're being misled. They're being misled by these Trinitarian apologetic nuts who fail to recognize the way the biblical text is written by the very one who wrote it, John. He's no more the Alpha and the Omega and the one coming quickly than is Jesus, in the sense that Trinitarians try to identify by the use of these texts. So I wanted to go over this with you because we've gone over all the texts where Jesus refers to himself as the first and the last in Revelation 1 and 2, which in the best representation of Revelation, Codex A, says firstborn and the last, just like Revelation 1:5 calls Jesus the firstborn from the dead, and just like Paul does in Colossians 1. And yet in Revelation 22, Codex A does not call the Alpha and the Omega the firstborn and the last. It calls him the first and the last. And there's no association between Jesus' use of first and last in Isaiah 44:6, as we've shown. Trinitarians do not present the truth there either. They're desperate, and they barely have anything to hold on to at this point. The Alpha and the Omega, that's like their last gasp. You know what I'm saying? This is like the one thing they thought they could always go to and show you, see here, I, Jesus, I am the Alpha and the Omega. Well, no, you see here, I am coming quickly. I, John. Or like in Revelation 1, 7, 8, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the one who is, who was, and who is coming. I, John. Now what do? Do they still believe the text? Do they still believe John? Just because Jesus isn't in the ultimate sense, or maybe even in any sense at all, the Alpha and the Omega? See, does he have to be that for you, Trinitarians? Is he not good enough for you? Just being the first and the last, the firstborn from the dead, the one whom the Father sent forth as Savior of the world. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about that with everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. I'll probably clip that as a follow-up to the Alpha and the Omega. But remember, they'll bring up that text, and it can be convincing, right? Because the way it's written in the quotations, the personal pronoun, you have to mark your Bible at Revelation 22, 15, 16, right there where Jesus speaks, or where it speaks of the Alpha and the Omega, and then it says, I, Jesus speaks, but before that it's the Alpha and the Omega. You need to show them a few verses earlier in Revelation 22, verses 6, 7, and 8, where John, it says, I, John, right after the one coming quickly speaks. And even more so, you need to mark in your text in Revelation 22 to check Revelation 1, 7, and 8. Because right there is an even better case of what Trinitarians are arguing for with you is identification in Revelation 22, 13 through 16. If that's true, then there's no question John is the Alpha and the Omega, right? I mean, it's even clearer, more clear in Revelation 1, 7, and 8. It's right next to it. Literally, the very next words. Alpha and the Omega, one who is, who was, and who is coming, I, John. Whereas in Revelation 22, 13 through 16, you not only have separation, but you have the earlier example in the text of Revelation 22 involving John and the one coming quickly. I agree. I don't like arguing either, G-Master. That's why I'm trying to bring this up so I can give people a shortcut to diffuse this, right? Because if an inexperienced Christian is confronted by an apologetic nut Trinitarian and they go to Revelation 22, 13 through 16, a sincere Christian might just be a little confused because they're not being presented with the writing style of John. The Trinitarian apologetic nut is not likely reading from Revelation 22, 1, right? Because then you'd at least see the one coming quickly is followed by I, John. And then that would trigger a sincere, genuine Christian to say, well, wait a minute. Earlier it said I, John, right after I am coming quickly. So why would it mean I, Jesus, is the Alpha and the Omega? But it's almost a sure thing. And I even had this happen on my Facebook page. And a nut who was on this channel and I had to ban came to me with these texts, Revelation 22, 13 through 16, and on my Facebook page. And I pointed out, hey, you're being dishonest. You're not showing verses 6, 7, and 8 where it's the I am coming quickly, I, John, and you're not showing Revelation 1, 7, and 8, and he didn't. And then when I pointed that out, he didn't have anything to say. I said, so you're no longer going to use that, right, without showing these texts? Nothing. Because he's not. He's a dishonest person who was trying to mislead me, and so will definitely try to mislead others by showing only Revelation 22, 13 through 16. That's a dishonest person. Or an ignorant person, right? Which is okay. You can be ignorant. But you shouldn't be teaching if you don't know what you're talking about, especially if it's in the same chapter. That is the writing style that's at issue. Nevertheless, we do have a lot of committed nuts, and their intent is to undermine your faith, to cause confusion. But with just a simple few texts like these, you can show, well, wait a minute. That doesn't identify him as that. And if it does, why don't you identify John as the Alpha and the Omega in Revelation 1, 7, and 8? See, there's no comeback. They can't. It's not only a better example, it directly refutes their reasoning. But they'll keep doing it. I guarantee you the one person who was dishonest with me isn't going to stop unless he has a change of heart, right? So prepare yourself. Don't lose sight of the fact that the sons of God in Jesus represent Jah himself. And if he allows them to speak as him as he does for his son, I don't even have a problem calling him the Alpha and the Omega if he is that one. Not because he is that one, but because he is allowed to be that one by worshiping him and imitating him in every single respect so well. He is given the name above every name, not for the glory of himself. This is key. The Alpha and the Omega wouldn't do anything for someone else's glory, but he would glorify someone who gave everything for his glory. And that's what's happening. That's what he's doing with his sons, and his firstborn son in particular. But I don't believe that even in this case we have Jesus really speaking in that way. He may be speaking, or the angel speaking for Jesus and John, that kind of communication channel that we described and that Revelation 1 talks about. But this narrative device of I, John, I, Jesus, keep that in mind, because the Trinitarian apologetic nuts, rather than help the poor and build up people's faith and fight against all the gross immorality and the pedos, they'd rather argue with you and me. So I, like G-Master, believe we shouldn't do that if we can at all help it. But if we need to help some people because it's their first time dealing with it, I think now we can. And we always could. It's just that these Trinitarian apologetic nuts have, like with flat earth, they bring up something that's really just kind of dumb in terms of the evidence, right? Like I've been showing these comparisons. It's silly to say John would be the Alpha and the Omega. But it requires you to spend time documenting what's obvious. And while that may have some value to have to keep doing it over and over, that's just, they're going to trap you. So that we cannot do. But we can win, and we can present our case. We can stand for the faith, and we should, just not all the time, right? Who wants to argue about these things all the time? They do. So let's avoid it at all costs. I thank you guys for joining me. I'll put up the notice later today for CW Jah Talk 21 tomorrow. This is going to be great. They're all good. But tomorrow, Isaiah 9:6, maybe Isaiah 11, we're going to talk about the text involving Jesus as calling him a prince, referring to him as everlasting Father, mighty God, angel of great counsel, according to the Greek translation. Oh, we got a lot of stuff. We'll tie it in with some other things. So I hope you'll join me. We'll probably start around 9:30. I'll put the notice up. Take a look at it. You can post in the chat. I'll try to cover information. Join me before the show for a little bit of pre-discussion and then a little bit after. So I'll see you all tomorrow. Have a great Saturday. And don't forget our day texts.